All right, welcome to the Balanced Hormones Empowered Women podcast. I am your host, Abby Vallejo, registered dietitian, certified personal trainer, and health coach. I teach women in perimenopause how to balance their hormones, lose body fat, and get toned in a feminine based approach that's about working smarter, not harder. And I have my good friend and fellow colleague, Courtney Cowie, here with me today. She is a functional diagnostic and nutrition practitioner. And today we are going to dive into the Dutch test. So I think Dutch is kind of a buzzword these days, wouldn't you say, Courtney?
Yeah, and do you know the full acronym for it? Abby, if we do, we should probably say it because it is an acronym,
We because people are
right?
like, Dutch? Is it from Holland?
I
Like,
know, it's funny,
is
isn't
it
it?
from
Yeah,
the
I think it's the
Netherlands? Like,
dried
what makes it Dutch? So it's
yeah,
what is it? Dried
dried urine
urine.
test for comprehensive hormones, I
Oh,
believe is what
good.
that
Okay, we got
yeah,
it.
is what the acronym is. So, yeah, but I know when I first heard of it, it was like Dutch test, Dutch test. I'm like,
What is a Dutch
"What
like, what is
is
this
that?"
Dutch test? Yeah. So it's a hormone test for anyone who didn't know that. It's a hormone test. It's a
Yeah.
urine-based test. So it's different than the test you would do if you went to the doctor and got a blood draw and just got like
Mhm.
estradiol or testosterone measured or something like that. The
Yeah.
Dutch is the gold standard in the holistic and functional realm, I would say, because it's so comprehensive. You get so many different things that get measured on a Dutch test. Of course, it's measuring your sex hormones. So it's measuring three types of estrogen. I think that's always surprising for women to hear, like, oh, I thought I just had estrogen. There's actually three main types of estrogen. So it measures that progesterone, testosterone, and then it measures your adrenal hormones. So your cortisol, which is, obviously your stress hormone, your DHEA, but it also gives you the metabolites of everything, which is so valuable because those metabolites, they act differently in the body depending on how you're metabolizing. And so it's kind of giving us this much more comprehensive picture of not just how much hormones are you making, but how are they acting and reacting in the body. And then there's another panel on there called an OAT test where, taking advantage that they have metabolites, they're looking at markers of things that interplay with hormone health, like neurotransmitters and B vitamins, B6 and B12. There's a gut health marker. There's an oxidative stress marker. It measures melatonin, which is your sleep hormone. Am I forgetting anything, Courtney?
No, I think that's kind of the gamut of it. And what's so great about that is, especially those B vitamins, a lot of them are cofactors for detoxification, which we get a read on, which is kind of what you're indicating to Abby, is like we can
Mhm.
look at the phase one, phase two pathways, some of them, not all of them, on the Dutch test. And what I love about it is because it has so much information. If, say, I've run a functional stool test alongside it, like the GI map, often
Mhm.
the two together will really fill in a lot of the gaps and will
Oh,
cross
yeah.
confirm things,
Yeah, I'm
right?
glad you said that because I think a lot of times we don't understand, like, it's not just what are my hormone levels, because we make hormones, then they do their job, and then they get deactivated and metabolized. And this happens every single day. This is a cycle. So it's not just like, oh, are my levels of estrogen good? Are my levels of progesterone good? It's, are they doing their job? Are they binding appropriately? And then are they getting deactivated and metabolizing in a safe and appropriate manner? And is that whole process happening every single day? So if you go in and you get a blood test done and you measure your estradiol, or the main form of estrogen, or your progesterone or your DHEA, it's not showing you that whole entire process of what's happening. It's only showing you that first step of how much is in your blood at that moment, right? And then depending on what time of the month you tested, which often, when I look
Mhm.
at blood test results that clients have done with their doctor, and I asked them, do you know what phase of the month of your cycle you were in when this was tested? 9 times out of 10, it's no. Honestly, that's probably 10 times out of 10, it's no.
Yeah.
And what you need to know about that is we're going to be at different levels. As women, our hormones are fluctuating all month long. So if you test your estrogen in the beginning of the month, it's going to be different levels naturally than it would be at the end of the month. So you need to know where you were at in your cycle for that to be an accurate representation, for you to understand, like, are these levels good and robust, or is it too high, too low, etc. So
Yep.
with the Dutch test, that's another thing I love, because not only does it give you the full process, not just what your levels are, but all the metabolites, and is the detoxification and metabolism happening appropriately. They also have you measure at a specific time of the month, so we know, are your levels appropriate for that time of the month, so we can judge accordingly. So it's not that big, like, mystery of, oh, I measured, but I didn't know where I was at in my cycle. So who knows if these levels actually mean anything or not, right?
Right, right, right. So let's just insert really quick here because I think, we assume this because we're practitioners, but just so the listener is really clear, If you're postmenopausal and you're no longer cycling, it's not as important when you would take a test like the Dutch test or even go get a blood draw if that's what you choose to do with
Oh,
your
yeah,
doctor
yeah,
because
good point. Obviously,
yeah,
that's for a woman who's in her reproductive years, who
right.
has a cycle, who has the fluctuations. Once you've gone through
Exactly.
menopause, that doesn't apply to the same degree, so then you can test any
Yes.
day because you don't have to plan around a period, but, if you are cycling, as we say, in your reproductive years, then yes, you do it in a certain window of the month to get the most accurate reading. I'm glad you said that.
Yeah, and ideally for cycling women, we wanna catch it when progesterone is at its highest, so we
Mhm.
get a really good read on, are we seeing that healthy optimal rise in progesterone, or did you just miscalculate and take this on the wrong day of the
Right,
month?
right,
And that's
yeah.
why we're seeing things aren't, going the way they should be going, right? So
Yeah,
that's
and that's
super
such a
important.
good point. I mean, and Dutch is real they have like a customer service. That's what I have clients call if they have trouble like calculating what day. Because you have to think about not every woman has a 28-day cycle, right? Like some
Yes.
women have longer, some women have shorter. So you have to like adjust it accordingly. They'll say like, oh, day 19 to 22, if day one was the first day of your period. But
Yes.
if my period is 20, if my cycle is 29 days, then it would be day 20 to 23 would be my window. So we do have to adjust it accordingly because yes, if you kind of miss the window, that can kind of skew your results for sure.
For sure. And perimenopause can be tricky just because the cycle starts to get irregular. So again,
Mhm,
I usually tell my female clients in that phase of life, like, don't stress over it. Do the best guess you can. If you want to be
mhm,
really specific, you can always go get ovulation strips and then check
mhm.
from there.
Yeah,
But more so or less, we're gonna still get good data. I mean, you just try to catch it about that time and
yeah.
honestly hope for the best sometimes in some of these
Yeah,
cases.
yeah, I know. I've definitely been through that with multiple clients in perimenopause where they're like, "I'm irregular now and I don't know when to do." So, yeah, we've definitely done the thing of like track when you ovulate and
Yep.
then like 5 to 7 days after that.
Yeah, and actually we should just mention this too, Abby. So another little trick, if you're really like good about it, is you can also keep a temperature gauge like right by your bed. And so
Mhm.
every morning before you get out of bed in the morning, just checking your basal body temperature. So one, thing that should be happening when progesterone is starting to go up is you should start to see that rise about a degree or more, right? And so
Oh, yeah.
usually from that day, you start to see that jump in temperature. You could kind of consider that that's about the time ovulation's happening, right? So, you don't have to necessarily go get strips or like I use an aura ring, which is super duper helpful, but not everybody likes that technology, those gadgets. We can use these other indicators to get a sense of about where a woman is in her cycle if she's still having one, right?
Yeah, what type of thermometer would that be?
I just think as long as it's got like to the hundredths degree, right? You don't just have like an old school mercury
Yeah,
thermometer,
yeah,
like you actually have a digital one that you can
yeah.
and this would be better too if like you're doing it for a month or more because you do want to kind of get a sense of what is your baseline
What's
pattern
normal for you?
because it can be
Mhm.
hard if you're just like starting it where you think you're ovulating, you have nothing to compare to. So I always tell
Yeah.
women if you want to use that and you want to take a Dutch test like in a month or two, start logging right now so you can get a
Mhm.
sense of like where that ovulation window is likely happening,
I think
right?
it's so fascinating to like start learning that stuff about our bodies and ourselves and start paying attention. I mean, I just remember the difference that I felt in my life since I started tracking my cycle and paying attention to that. It's
Absolutely.
just
Yeah.
so illuminating. It's like, how did I go so many years without knowing this? You
Oh,
know?
for sure. And there's other sides. I mean, we could talk a lot about this, Abby, but not to go on too much. But this is also kind of part of the problem for a lot of women is we just aren't taught necessarily the subtle signs to look for as our bodies are changing over the month. And so, if you're really in tune with your body, you will start to notice like fertile mucus production, right? Like
Mhm.
those are all really good clues that you can use and base kind of like the testing off of if you're super in touch and in tune with things. But I just find a lot of women really don't have a good solid understanding. They just kind of know, well, I'm pretty regular, or I tend to vary. Sometimes it's short,
Mhm.
or I tend to go long, right? They can
Yeah.
express that, but they're not necessarily like day by day, like, oh, I have a sense of where I'm at, with
Yeah.
my cycle. So,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, it's so empowering to get that for sure.
yeah,
So, I think now that we've kind of talked about what the Dutch test is, and I would recommend I guess we should say who it's for, but really I would say for every woman, like I did my first one at age 35 because I was like, well, I have some underlying symptoms that I want to be sure of, and I also want to get a baseline of where I'm at before I'm really officially going through perimenopause and getting closer to that age. But definitely if you have any type of symptoms hormonal symptoms, but even things like fatigue or low energy, or it could be the classic, hot flashes or night sweats or, trouble losing weight, like a lot of weight loss resistance. I mean, there's so, painful periods if you have endometriosis or if you have cysts or fibroids, if you have irregular cycles, really anything like that. If you're getting like really bad migraines on a regular basis,
Mhm.
I mean, there are so many reasons to test your hormones just to see where you're at. And especially if you're in perimenopause, those years leading up to menopause, or going through menopause or even after, like, let's make sure your hormones are still at a healthy level to help protect you from diseases of aging like dementia and heart disease. And
Exactly.
yeah, and things like that. And, osteoporosis and things like that.
Yeah, and I think like you said, Abby, it's such a great tool to use to get a baseline if you can, if you're very proactive about your health while you're still in your cycling stage of life, right? Because if you're at all remotely interested in using bioidentical hormone replacement therapy as you approach menopause, studies show that bringing that in earlier rather than later leads to better outcomes for women, right?
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. We don't want to wait until our hormones just crash and we have nothing left in the tank before we start doing something about it.
totally.
We want to ease that transition and, make ourselves feel better, look better, have more energy, not have all those crazy symptoms. And that's completely possible. So tests like the Dutch test can help us achieve that, especially if we start before those symptoms get really bad. Obviously, of course, once they're really bad, yes, please do a test because we can still fix and rebalance that. But, if we start early, we can kind of head it off.
Exactly. Yeah, for sure. The other useful thing I'll just insert here too is I do find sometimes women come to see me and they express fear of cancer down the road because they've got a family history of cancer, right? And so, one really great thing about the Dutch test, in my opinion, we'll get into this when we look at your test and mine too, Abby, is it will show specifically how a woman metabolizes estrogen, which there can be correlations with certain ways of metabolizing estrogen and increased risk for cancer. So, I think that would be another category of women out there. If you've been through cancer and nobody's really explained this to you, you want to have a more comprehensive hormone test done to really
Mhm.
look at, can we help support any
Yeah.
unhealthy estrogen metabolism and
Yep.
or you fear it in the future. Your mother's had it, your grandmother, maybe a
Mhm.
sister or a cousin or whomever. This
Yep.
would be a really great proactive test to invest in to get a better understanding of how your body's operating so you can support that and correct things in a more balanced way.
Oh, yeah. I'm so glad that you said that because that can be corrected. If you're like the higher risk of cancer is associated with not metabolizing estrogen properly. But once we know that, we know what to do about it, which is the beauty of it. So there's no reason to be afraid of estrogen. And
Exactly.
I feel like I'm telling women that all the time. Like, estrogen is bad. There's no reason to be afraid of estrogen. She just
Exactly.
needs to be in balance with your other hormones and she needs to be metabolizing properly. And if that's happening, you're good.
Exactly. 100% Abby. Yeah. So
Yeah.
I just want to put that out there because I know that is a lot of women that worry about that type of thing and maybe wouldn't think about it other than the cancer risk. Like they're like, well,
Mhm.
my hormones are my hormones, but
Yeah.
cancer is a very big one for people. It's
Right.
very frightening,
Right.
right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
so really, really valuable information. I'm glad you said that. So I'm thinking at this point, let me just pull up my own Dutch test so we can look through it and I can talk. I found like, let's say 5 to 6 like major things from this Dutch test that for me were absolutely life-changing when I was able to know for sure and then correct them. So yeah, let me share my screen and we can dive into that. So you can see if you're on Spotify or anywhere, you should go and watch this on YouTube so you can actually see the visual because I have pulled up a copy of my hormone test, my own personal one, so
Mhm.
that you can see the visual here as we're explaining this. I think that would be more helpful.
Yeah.
Okay. So, main findings here. So, when you're looking at a Dutch test, let me just explain this. This kind of looks like the speedometer on your car. So, on the first page, it's going to give you a summary of your sex hormones and a summary of your adrenal hormones. And then it goes into the metabolites and more info on the following pages. So, here we're just looking at a summary. So, what I can see right away now, I
And
was
Abby,
35. What's
Abby,
that?
maybe talk about the purple and the green too, because I think that might be
Oh,
helpful for
yeah, yeah,
people.
thank you
Yeah.
for saying that.
Yeah.
So, the purple here, this is postmenopause. So, if you've already gone through menopause, you have a little bit of a different range than someone who's in their reproductive years, where we'd want to see you in the green, in between these two stars, right? All right, so estradiol, that's the main form of estrogen. It's the strongest one during the reproductive years. Being that I was age 35 when I took this test, we would expect to see this arrow solidly in the middle of the green. That would be the ideal, except look where it is. It's down almost in the purple, as if I was in the postmenopausal range, which should not be the case at age 35. So this explained a lot to me because I was having symptoms, like I was getting brain fog really bad. At the time, I remember I'd be like explaining things to a client and I'd be like in mid sentence and I would completely forget the word that I was about to say, which was super embarrassing. Does that ever happen to anybody? Can anyone relate with that? You're talking and all of a sudden you're like, whoa, what was I just about to say? Where did that word go? It just disappeared.
Yeah.
That was happening to me all the time. It was really embarrassing, especially for someone who has always had like a sharp memory and like pretty fast cognition. And just as a practitioner, it's just that was just super embarrassing. Um, I was also having like more prone to injuries like bones and joints, like weak joints and like joint injuries. I noticed that I was getting these a lot. I mean, I'm always in the gym, I'm working out, and I just feel like there was more wear and tear happening on my body. Estrogen is important for healthy bones and healthy joints. So this kind of, when I saw this, I was like, oh, this is probably why I was having so many issues with my joints and just like getting injured more often than I should be. Um, Dry hair and skin. That's always been a thing for me. Like just my skin being really dry, my hair being really dry. Low estrogen is really coupled with a picture of dryness and vaginal dryness included. So that's something that I had struggled with a lot was vaginal dryness, which, in my 20s and 30s, you'd think that shouldn't be an issue, but it was. And that kind of ties into like a lower sex drive because, it's just not as pleasant and if you don't have as much sensation and, so that was also an issue in my life. So when I saw this, I was like, first I wanted to cry. I literally almost burst into tears. No kidding. So I have so much empathy for women when I look at their Dutch test and it's all like out of whack and everything. I'm like, I know how you feel. Like I wanted to cry when I saw mine. But then I was like, okay, this explains a lot. Like I'm not crazy. It's not all in my head. Sometimes doctors make us feel, or, society kind of makes us feel that. I was like, this explains my problem. It's not that I don't find my partner attractive. Like I think
Right.
sometimes there's so much guilt about that as women. Like, why don't I have a libido? Like, what's wrong with me? And our husbands think that we don't find them attractive or something. And it's not that. Sometimes
Yeah.
it's just your hormones, and we got to like rebalance those for that spark to come back. Right. So don't blame
Right.
yourself for that. Get your hormones tested. So that was the big stuff with estrogen. Progesterone doesn't look too bad. I mean, it's not as robust as I'd like to see, but I'm still in the green. I also think I tested a day early since my cycle is 29 days long instead of 28. I was like a day or two early because we were going on a road trip. So I do think that this probably would have been a little bit higher had I been like solidly in the window. Um, Testosterone, this looks okay. And then the other big thing on the first page that really stands out, and you can probably tell if you're zooming in. So here we're looking at the adrenal hormones. This is I call it a cortisol curve, but it's not really a curve, is it? It's just when you do the Dutch test, you actually take multiple samples over the course of a day and night. The reason that you do that is because we want to measure your cortisol. Your cortisol is different at different times of the day. It's supposed to be like that. It's supposed to be higher in the morning because that gives us energy to get up and get out of bed and get moving. It's alertness and awakeness. And then it gets lower in the afternoon and it tapers off and gets low at night so we can fall asleep. And that cycle happens every single day, or it's supposed to. So we want to measure, is that happening appropriately? So you can see here in mine, there's the two black lines are the higher range and the lower range limit. Well, what happens in the morning here is mine is spiking up super high. And this made sense to me because I was always like a chicken running around with its head cut off in the morning. Like I would just get this rush and I would just be like, "Bah, bah, bah, bah," like, just panicking. And I don't know, I was so frazzled and disoriented. And this would happen every morning as I was getting ready. And so I saw that and I was like, well, that makes sense. Like I'm getting a huge cortisol spike. And I know a lot of times this happens if we have stressful mornings and if women are like not in my case, but women are like getting their kids ready for school and they're trying to get to work and there's just all these things that are happening in the morning. A lot of times it's like that anticipatory stress of what's going to happen in the day or the rush, that can really cause a big spike in the morning. So I could definitely feel that. It made me feel comforted to know like, okay, I'm not imagining this. I am in fact having a big cortisol spike in the morning. And that is why I feel so disoriented and frazzled. So then the other thing that really stands out, if you look at the red here, my 24-hour free cortisol. So this is the amount of cortisol that my body's making, that my tissues are exposed to. Obviously, this is high. I'm getting a big spike in the morning. I'm making a lot of cortisol. So kind of high stress, ongoing situation there, not handling it too well. But conversely, so we look at how much cortisol your body's making, and then we look at how much cortisol your body is metabolizing. Look at this. I'm so low. I'm below the normal amount of metabolizing cortisol. So this tells me, I always like to see these arrows pointing in just about the same direction. Here, my normal's pointing in opposite directions, right? So this tells me my body's making a lot of cortisol, but I'm not metabolizing it. And there can be a few reasons that this can happen. This could be like a low thyroid function. It could be like a sluggish metabolism, poor liver, poor bile function. If you have suboptimal mitochondria, which is, your cellular energy, there could be multiple reasons, but it's kind of an overall picture of sluggishness. Or sometimes you see this when the body has a lot of inflammation or maybe stealth infections, and it's trying to hold on to that cortisol rather than use it because it's something that's valuable to make, right? So the body is never wasteful. So sometimes the body will try and hold on to that cortisol rather than metabolize it out. So those are the big findings on there. Any thoughts, Courtney, or anything that you would add?
Yeah. So, I mean, looking at the daily free cortisol pattern, just one thing I want to make clear to the person looking at this who's not familiar with this test is that because we're doing urine samples, we're getting a 90-minute post clearance picture. So, where it says waking, what we're actually capturing there is overnight cortisol production. Where it says morning, what we're actually capturing there is like that first, as of like 30 minutes, 60 minutes getting up. And so
Mhm.
that's why when you're talking, Abby, about like, yeah, I'm having this huge spike, that would be kind of that window where most people are kind of getting out of bed and it's like that
Mhm.
rush, 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 right? So
Yep.
for sure. The other thing I just want to mention is I think like what is remarkable too is, when I look at just your summary page, I think the fact that you're actually having progesterone in the green is still pretty impressive given that your metabolized cortisol is so low because we know that that's that same hormone pathway. So sometimes when you see metabolized cortisol super duper low, I would anticipate seeing really low sex hormones across the board, right?
Yeah,
Because
yeah,
we're
definitely.
kind of talking more that exhaustive state. Now, in the
Mhm.
context of really high free cortisol, this is a little bit more of that wired but tired type of picture where you're
Mhm.
having a real discordance there. But,
Yeah.
sometimes when I look at a Dutch that looks like that from an adrenal standpoint, I often don't see even progesterone rising into the green because the body is just so tanked, right?
Yeah, that's a good point for
Yeah.
sure. Yeah, and I think sometimes, women are like, "Oh, I'm not tired. I have plenty of energy." And it's like, "Zzz," and it's like, yeah,
Totally.
that's you're running on adrenaline. That is not sustainable. And, that was kind of my case too. I was running on a lot of adrenaline here. So,
Yeah. And this
yeah.
this would be a picture too where I would definitely say getting a full thyroid panel to like
Mhm.
rule that in or rule that out would be really, really good just with that level of like difference between free and
Oh,
metabolized
yeah.
cortisol.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, just to make sure that that's not part of the problem there.
for
Absolutely.
sure, for sure.
Okay. This second page, so this is just kind of the numerical values. They show the visuals on the other page. I do want to call your attention to one thing though, because this is not going to be a visual on the next page. This 5-DHT. So how we were saying there's the hormone itself and then there's its metabolites, right? And so so these are all the hormones themselves and then the metabolites where you see like the things with the numbers like the 2OH and the 4OH and the 16, etc. These are all the metabolites of the actual hormone. So, yes, we saw my estrogen was low, so of course we're going to see below range. So coming down here, one thing that they didn't show on the first page is the different metabolites of the androgens, which is basically like testosterone and DHEA, right? And my DHEA and my testosterone looked pretty normal. They're within range, right? However, there's something called DHT, which is dihydrotestosterone. And I say like this is so the body has testosterone and then it can convert it into DHT, which is like a super ultra souped up potent version of testosterone. So there's like testosterone and then there's testosterone on steroids, which is 5 alpha DHT. Now,
Mhm.
that's really important in men when they're like developing sexually as a teenager and they're like growing their bodies and a prostate and their voice is deepening and all of that kind of stuff. But we don't want to have too much of that because just like I said, it's testosterone on steroids. Think of a guy on steroids, right? He's probably like angry, he's probably aggressive, he's probably bald, he probably has body acne, like oily skin. You know what I mean? Like, just, it's kind of what I think of. We don't want too much DHT because that's the guy on steroids. Well, especially for a woman, right? So I'm at the high end of the range of DHT here. So it's not crazy high, but it's high enough to give me symptoms of too much testosterone in my body. And in fact, I was experiencing these things and this explained a lot. So thinning and balding hair, especially like how males kind of the male pattern baldness, I was experiencing that. Acne, facial acne, body acne, oily skin. I was always having issues with that. Anger, this was another one. And sometimes this is a little harder to admit for us as women or to pinpoint. But anger and aggression, like normally I'm a pretty calm, happy go lucky person. But I was having these bouts where I would just get really aggressive or really angry, and even just on the inside. But I was like, why am I feeling like this? Why am I reacting like this? Why is my tendency to get so angry and aggressive? Do you just kind of snap, right? It's like that hot headed temper. So I know that was definitely affecting me. And then like chin hairs or facial hairs, unwanted body hair. So, getting more, we all have probably like one little or two little hairs on our chin as women, like that's normal, but getting more where you're getting those little whiskers growing there, that's a sign of too much testosterone and or potentially DHT. So, testosterone is good. We actually need quite a bit of testosterone as women to be healthy, but especially the DHT, the testosterone on steroids, we do not want that to be too high. So, even though my testosterone levels were normal, because my DHT was at the high end of the range, I was getting these symptoms of too much testosterone. So that was like a huge eye opener for me. Any thoughts, Courtney?
No, this is really good. Yeah. I
Okay.
usually just kind of glance at this page because like you said, for women, it's good to get the breakdown in the
Mhm.
androgen metabolites because we won't see this on the male Dutch. You will get it, but not on the female Dutch. So it is good just to kind of check that. And then all of this numerical information is going to show up more so pictorially on the next page. So I
Mhm.
find
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
can be a little bit easier for the layperson to follow because there's a little bit more of that, like, picture layout
Yeah,
of
I think
everything.
the visuals are easier too, but since they
Yeah,
don't show the DHT on the visual, I actually
right.
missed it the first time I looked at this because I
I
just kind of
could,
skipped over this page.
I
And then when I
know.
went back and I was like, wait a minute, why is this not explaining my like high testosterone symptoms when my testosterone looks normal? I was like, oh, there we go. There's the DHT. That is why.
Exactly. No, it's really good to still look at everything. And for men on their Dutch, they're not going to have progesterone, but it's reported on this page, right? So either way, like it's always good just to look at all of this as
Yeah.
well. Yeah.
Yep. Okay. So this, and the first time I ever looked at this page, I was like, oh my God, what is happening?
A
So
lot here, right?
yeah, so basically the way I explain this is when we look at a Dutch test, I'm like, okay, this is like the order of operations. So if we think about the order that your hormones are made in, if we actually started from the raw material that your sex hormones are made from, it's cholesterol, right? And then just to really simplify this, then cholesterol gets made into pregnenolone, which is like the godmother hormone. And then from there, she diverts off and we either make progesterone or we make DHEA and testosterone, which then gets aromatized into estrogen and then it gets metabolized. So it's basically just showing you the flow chart and the order in which all the hormones are made and metabolized. So it looks complicated, but when you think of it in that context, it makes a lot of sense how they've laid it out this way.
Mhm.
So and it's interesting because you look at like my DHEA looks good, my testosterone looks good, and then here, so what we said, it measures metabolites, so you'll see those as two different pathways. There's alpha and beta. Alpha, of course, is a stronger metabolite than beta is, and so that kind of tells us, how is this metabolite acting in the body? And so at first, I was really confused before I saw the 5-DHT thing because I was thinking, okay, I don't have too high levels of testosterone. And I have a beta preference. Beta is weaker than alpha. So I shouldn't have like a strong, potent form of testosterone, too strong in the body, but I have the 5-DHT. which explains why. So that's why Dutch is so valuable because it gives you so many different clues and things to consider. So if you have a weird situation that isn't like easily explained, you can really put the clues together and figure that out and find the explanation why from a Dutch test. And then from testosterone, we, aromatase, this just we actually make estrogen out of our testosterone. Before I go into that, just going back up to progesterone, alpha and beta, it's showing that I have a beta preference here. But still in the green, the alpha is a little low on that side, but that's overall, that's fine. And then let's zoom in on estrogen because that's like the area that, I was definitely low in estrogen and having problems with that. So, as I mentioned, we make estrogen out of testosterone, that's the aromatase. And then it gets broken down into three different forms of estrogen here. So we have estrone, which is more present during menopause, estradiol, which is the strongest form of estrogen, more present during reproductive years, and then estriol, which is a weaker but protective form of estrogen. She helps balance estradiol out, and this can also be a lot higher during pregnancy, which makes sense. Your hormones are skyrocketing during pregnancy, so you'd want to have higher levels of a protective form of estrogen that helps balance out. Because estrogen is growth, right? Estrogen is like grow, grow, grow a baby, grow skin, grow hair, grow, 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 which is like good, but uncontrolled growth is bad because then we get, fibroids and cysts and tumors and lumps and things like that we don't want to happen. So estrogen is perfect when she's in her sweet spot, but if she's out of balance, that's not good. So that's why we want good levels of progesterone and good levels of estriol to balance out estradiol. So, I was glad to see here that my, despite everything being low, the estriol levels were, not lower. So that's good. It's just kind of like low across the board, just kind of balanced. So another thing to look at. And then with estrogen, the metabolism gets a little more complicated than just alpha or beta because we have the three different receptors there. So we're actually metabolizing it down different pathways. There's the green, the red, and the blue. Now I make this really simple and I always say the green is the good pathway, the red is bad, and the blue is more neutral. So it matters how we metabolize our estrogen, right? And the reason the green pathway is good is those metabolites are very stable. And the body likes that. The body likes anything that's really stable. It's easy to handle. They know what to expect. It's not hyper reactionary, right? We don't like things that are very reactionary. We like things that are stable. The red is quote unquote bad because that metabolite, this right here, this 4-OHE1, this is very unstable. And unstable means reactive, and reactive means damage, right? Like oxidative damage. So if this is too high, it could be creating lots of oxidative damage in the body. And this is where you were saying, or Courtney was saying earlier, that there can be a higher risk of things like breast cancer. If this pathway is too overused, we're making lots of unstable metabolites, it can increase our risk of things like breast cancer and DNA damage. And then the blue pathway. And then this one I find it has to do more with like urinary and uterine health. So sometimes if this is too low for women, they might be more prone to issues with the bones, issues with recurring like UTIs or uterine prolapse. So it's important to make sure that this one is also, adequate. Enter this pie graph. So this is going to show you what we expect to see, the percentage we expect to see going down each of the pathways, right? So we expect to see 60 to 80% going down the green pathway. We expect to see 7.5 to 11% going down the red, and we expect to see 13 to 30% going down the blue. That's normal and expected. That's healthy, right? We want to be in those ranges. So I am actually a little high with the green pathway. I have 86.1. I'm on the lower end of the red, 7.6, which is good because you don't want to be high for that one. And I'm below the normal at 6.2 for the blue pathway. So this is where, I'm really going to want to support my estrogen to make sure that I don't have problems with like bone health, with uterine prolapse in the future, with UTIs or things like that. I want to make sure that my levels of estriol are good and robust enough to help prevent things like that, especially as I age and go to menopause, go through menopause. So that gives me some clues of things that I need to be working on. Also, so I would say another major finding here for me. So if we go back to the green pathway, and these are stable metabolites, right? And I always give the example like, this is like how your body takes out the trash. And when you're taking out the trash, you want it to be nicely packaged. You don't want it to be leaking. You want it to be an easy bag that you can just take out and put in the trash. Easy, no mess, right? So that's what these stable metabolites are. They're packaged, they're neutralized, and they're taken out so they can no longer be reactionary or cause problems. Easy way to take out the trash appropriately. So this is kind of what we're measuring here. And so I'm like, this first step, okay, this is great. This is working really good. I'm glad to see that. Then I'm looking at, the methylation here, and that's not as great. And then it shows you this fan style gauge of, your methylation activity. Now, if you've heard of methylation, this doesn't represent methylation of your entire body, which a lot of people have problems with, but it does represent methylation of your estrogen metabolites. So this is really important to be doing this adequately because, you don't want a leaky, messy trash that's leaking all over as you take it out and causing problems, right? So here I know that genetically that I have the MTHFR polymorphism just systemically where I don't methylate as well, right? I know that genetically I have issues with that. So I really wasn't that surprised to see that my methylation is kind of on the lower end here. So that's something that I kind of think about supporting in my body, estrogen specific, but also like overall, just to make sure that my body is able to detox and clear things out appropriately. What are your thoughts, Courtney?
Yeah, no, for sure. So basically, kind of what you're saying is that methylation pathway is not optimally open and functioning. And so, like, although your estrogen is pretty well balanced for sure, like the 2OH, 4OH, 16OH, like, if, for example, your 4OH E1 was high, what the body will try to do as a backup to not being able to deal with these high quinones is push them down this methylation pathway, which in your case, if that was high, Abby, would be a little bit problematic because we've kind of got like a clog in the drain there, right? So that
Mhm.
would be something where, again, to
Yeah.
support that and just looking at it from, we're talking hypotheticals because this isn't your case, but if this was a woman who had a higher 4-OHE1, we want to make sure that methylation pathway is open. And if it's not, totally correct that. So yeah, I totally agree with that. And the other thing I'll say too is like so these CYP3A4, CYP1B1, CYP1A1, these different pathways here, these are what are called phase 1 detoxification pathways in the liver. So one thing I check is I look to see, is the E1 gauge at least equal to or less than the 4OH and the 2OH? And if yours is, Abby, so that tells me your phase 1 clearance is good. We want to make sure
Mhm.
both those pathways are open and working so we don't have any backups in hormone detoxification. So yeah.
Oh yeah, that's such a good point, is that if
Mhm.
your phase 1 is happening really quick and your phase 2 is not able to keep up with it, that's not good. So yes, that's a
Yes.
really good point. We always want to check that and support that if needed.
For sure. We could almost say that phase 1 actually makes metabolites more toxic and then phase 2 less. So, like, we definitely
Yeah.
want those 2 pathways, like, balanced. I mean, in your case, it's not really an issue because your metabolites are more so lower end, they're within range. But if we were talking super high estrogen levels getting cleared through that pathway, plus
Mhm.
that person has a lot of other toxicities that might be
Mhm.
trying to get cleared through that pathway, we could have some toxic burden symptoms just
Yeah.
collectively, right?
Yeah. But that's so helpful to know because so many women do have that going on. So then when you see it and you know what's happening, then we know what to do.
Exactly,
Yeah,
exactly.
good
Yeah.
point. Okay, so numerical values, I'm kind of going to skip over this. These are the cortisol metabolites. All right,
Mhm.
so the visual picture, now this is just kind of the flow chart for cortisol and our adrenal hormones. So, the way that stress affects the brain, the signals that are getting sent out, the adrenal glands, which are the little glands that make DHEA and cortisol. Then you have the pineal gland, which is making melatonin, which is our sleep hormone. So that looks good. I was also taking some sleep support at this time, not melatonin per se, but yeah, I really wasn't concerned that this was on the higher end. First of all, it wasn't above. And also, melatonin is a really potent antioxidant. So it does help protect your body. So it is, having it a little on the higher end, I think is totally fine, especially if someone's supplementing. This can tend to run high. Then my DHEA and my cortisol, which this is the metabolized form of cortisol. We already saw that on the previous page, how that's low. And then they give you the two different graphs. Cortisone is just metabolized cortisol. So we're just looking to see, do these kind of track? Are they pretty similar? Or do we see any big differences between the two? Not really. I kind of have the same picture at both. And then, both are in the red and too high, which was not surprising because I certainly was running on adrenaline during that time. So anything you want to say about that, Courtney?
Yeah, so just one thing to look at in terms of just total DHEA, total cortisol production. I do like to kind of point out when I'm going through this test that like we want to see those in balance. I rarely do we, right? Because we're looking
Right,
at
right.
people with
Ideally,
chronic
we
health
do,
issues.
but we usually don't.
Yeah, but the sort of, I guess, good thing with your test, at least preferable, I would say, is we're seeing DHEA higher than cortisol. So that tells me you're actually more so in an anabolic state versus a catabolic state, which is
Mhm.
preferable, right? Like we want to
Yeah.
see the body more so in that building up production versus like breaking down. That
Mm.
can often be the case with a lot of inflammatory conditions. When we look at that fan gauge below metabolized cortisol, that's kind of giving us a read on systemic preference for cortisone to cortisol. That's something too I'll look at it. And if it's leaning more in the direction of like more cortisone systemically, preferentially happening, that often will correlate with more so like the body kind of trying to get that person to slow down, deal with sometimes emotional stress, trauma, that type of stuff. So I always ask that question if I see it on the test. It's like, do you feel like you're in a place of feeling really bogged down emotionally or you're dealing with a lot of stress, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And yeah, and what you were saying about DHEA, I've heard people describe DHEA as the stress recovery hormone. So cortisol is your stress hormone, DHEA is your stress recovery hormone. So
Yeah.
making sure that these levels are robust to balance out cortisol. And it's important for not just like healthy aging and energy, but also like good immunity, like you were saying, having a healthy immune system. So we want to make sure that we have enough DHEA.
For sure.
Yep. Okay, and then for the oat test, the organic acid test, we don't have a visual that goes with it, so we're just going to look at the numbers themselves. So like I was saying, it's measuring your B12, your B6, your glutathione, we have a biotin marker, we have a gut marker, we have some neurotransmitters here. You can see that my norepinephrine and epinephrine metabolite is low. This can tend to happen if you're someone like me who runs on adrenaline and you're just burning it up because you're running on that. That could be one case. Um, and then melatonin, which is normal. And then the other one, and this one was the other reason I wanted to cry, was the oxidative stress marker, which is a measure of basically DNA damage and like free radical damage, inflammaging. If you've heard if you guys have heard the term inflammaging, it's inflammation and aging. My oxidative stress was high, which is not good. And I was noticing that I was getting rapid skin aging. I was getting more hyperpigmentation. I was getting age spots. Um, so it really didn't surprise me when I saw this because I was like, yeah, I feel like I am seeing this. And, there was damage happening inside my body that I couldn't see, but it was showing up on my skin in terms of me just seemingly starting to age more quickly, faster than
Mhm.
it should have been at age 35.
Yeah. And one thing to say about kind of the organic acids is because this is urine testing, the vitamin markers are not going to be as sensitive as, say, going in and getting like a serum blood draw. So, like in a situation like this where your methylation pathway was down regulated, even though your vitamin B12 marker looks good, I might still suggest doing, like if this was a client, right? I might
Mhm.
suggest still doing some form of methyl B12 support specifically, but also maybe in tandem with a methyl B complex just to kind of round everything out.
Yeah, and especially knowing that I have issues with methylation,
Yeah,
that would
because
be
I
supporting. Yeah.
yeah, I just don't always fully trust, like, sometimes I'm like, story doesn't add up from the organic acids, but we're seeing that that
Yeah.
pathway's down
Yeah.
regulated. So I'd rather err on the side of making sure nutrient support is adequate so we can support
Mhm.
that pathway rather than be like, well, you're probably okay. Also, in the context of like indican, right? Like for me, anything over 60 is starting to indicate a little bit of like
Yep.
low
Yep.
stomach
Mine's a
acid,
little on the highish end,
little
even
bit
though they
high.
haven't flagged it.
Yeah, and that would make me think about too, if truly low stomach acid is a part of the picture, likely B12 is
Mhm.
going to be low too, just because
Mhm.
you need to have
Yeah.
intrinsic factor stomach acid to cleave that. So I would kind of be looking at some of those subtle clues and thinking, okay, this might still be one we
Yeah.
support just to make sure from a hormone clearance standpoint, we've got all the necessary cofactors on board.
And
Yeah.
I love how that all ties together because I have had issues with low stomach acid in the past. And that is
Yeah.
something I had to bring in and methylated B vitamins. So 100%.
And
Yeah.
that's like most people, Abby, actually.
Yeah. Yeah, most people.
Most
Yeah, like
people.
who hasn't have issues with that? Like that is just so
Oh,
common.
yeah.
And we just go on, like we just push forward thinking we're fine, but so often there's those underlying things. So this is just it gives us a really like helpful indication to know. And then like Courtney, like you were saying, we always take into account other testing and the symptoms that the person is having and their overall health picture. It's kind of like putting all the pieces together. And I
Yep,
love when things tie together like, oh yeah, your indican's just a little higher even though they didn't flag it. Oh, your B12 might be a little less than robust. Let's focus on B12, methyl B12 methylation, stomach
yeah,
acid. And I'm like, yeah, I had all of those. So that's
totally.
perfect.
Totally.
Yeah.
And hopefully this isn't getting too overly complex. Like, it's funny when we look at tests like that, I'm starting to put my like clinical advisor hat on, be like, oh, and this,
Mhm.
and this, and this. And so
Yeah, yeah. But that's what we do, and so, if you're still here with us watching this, like, you don't have to understand how all this works because we do, and we will walk you
exactly.
through it in a way that you understand, and it makes so much more sense, and it's so much more meaningful when it's yours,
Yes.
because you will never understand something so well as when it's your own, right?
The
So
buy-in is
it'll
there.
give you
Yeah.
another level of understanding about your body, and that's what we're both so passionate about education. Like, when we sit down with you and go through these tests with you, we don't wanna just tell you, "Oh, yeah, you're gonna take this, you're gonna do this, you're gonna do that." We wanna give you that knowledge and empowerment of understanding what's going on in your body so you don't feel crazy, so you understand why you're having the symptoms that you are, or why you're having some lingering health issues or digestive issues or this and that. We can help you do that. So if this all seemed really complicated, just know that you're getting a lot of really valuable information that means something to us, and we will be able to translate that for you and come up with a meaningful, tailored protocol to you that will make a big positive impact on your health and your hormones.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah. Should we go over yours now? I would love to see
Yeah.
yours.
Yeah, let's do it. I'll try to go move through it a little more swiftly and then we can we can
I feel like mine was a little longer because I was trying to explain like
yeah,
what
which
was
is good.
happening. Yeah,
That's
just
good,
so
Abby.
people could get an idea of, what is this and what is that? But now that we kind of have that basic understanding out of the way.
Yeah, no, that's really good. We need to kind of have that to be able to set the stage for things. So yeah, so this is my test as of gosh, this would have been about 2 years old now. So keep in mind at the time I took it I was 42, right? So I'm a little older now. I can say probably even back at this point in time I was starting to hit the early stages of perimenopause if not already in it, right? So with that context, obviously still cycling. So when I captured this data, it would have been like around day 19, day 20 of my cycle. So that's exactly where we want to get it because again, we want to make sure progesterone is rising appropriately as it should be at that time of the month. So, in my case, I would say obviously this isn't super optimal. I always tell people that, what we're really shooting for is middle of the green zone, but then thinking through the age and stage of life the client you're dealing with, right? Like for a young 40 something, this isn't too bad either, I would say, for
That looks
progesterone.
like great progesterone to me.
Yeah. Yeah, so we can really see like where the problems are coming in similar to yours, Abby, is like that DHEA pathway and specifically lower testosterone,
Mhm.
lower estradiol, right? Now,
Yep.
the other thing that's just important to say that at this point in time, I think one of the driving reasons I took the Dutch test, other than I just thought, well, I'm in my 40s, I should check my hormones anyhow, was this particular summer I had been doing some more specific like long distance running, I guess not super long depending on what your definition of that is, but at the time I was aiming to complete a 10K with my husband, so we were both 3 4 days a week going out and running. And I had in the beginning I felt pretty good, but then there kind of came a point few months into that where I was like, man, I am not feeling awesome. I feel like I have to push through
Mhm.
these runs. I'm definitely
Yeah.
not getting a runner's high. This
Yeah.
is not very enjoyable, but now I'm
Yeah.
committed. So I feel
Right.
like
Yeah. So we just push through. I mean, how
you
many
just
women do, right?
yeah, and we had already, like, paid for and put the race on the calendar, so I'm one of those people where it's like I set a goal, I really wanna complete it or find
I'm
a way
gonna
to
do
complete
it.
it,
Yeah.
so but at the same time, I was like, "This will be really good to take this Dutch because I do wanna see is there something that would correlate with how I'm feeling?" And so
And look at that. You had like no
I
gas in the tank.
I know, 100%. So this was kind of surprising, although not when I got it back, right? Like really correlated with the level of fatigue I was having. And symptomatically, in my case, like the biggest thing that I remember like struggling with was even if I could get through those like runs on the days I was doing like the training, I would have to come home and drink another cup of coffee just to have like
Mm.
adequate energy to feel like I could like go into my day. Like I don't know
Yeah.
that I would have crashed in bed, but it would have been a real fight. Like, and I would
Yeah.
feel pretty fatigued for the next like couple hours. It was like my body really was struggling to kind of recover.
Yeah.
And this is the reason why. Like there just wasn't cortisol available to like, support energy levels right at that period of
And
time.
I see this all the time with ladies who come and do the Dutch test with me who have low energy. And that's why I just started saying like there's no gas left in the tank. If you don't have any cortisol, I mean, look at how low you're like across the bottom. Your daily free
Exactly.
cortisol pattern is completely across the bottom. It's even
Yep.
too low in the morning. You didn't get any boost in the morning to help you like get up and go. Your 24
Totally.
hour free cortisol is low. Your metabolized cortisol is low. It's like you don't have gas left in the tank to run on.
Exactly. So we would call this exhaustive phase of that, what we call hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis of dysfunction, where Abby actually went through a really good explanation when we were talking about thyroid a week or two ago, where, in the beginning, we'll see cortisol levels kind of go up and up and up, and people are overproducing in that
Like
first stage.
mine. So I would be more
Yeah.
of a phase 1 where I'm in that like response, like cortisol response. My body's like pumping out a lot of cortisol, but then if that continued on for too long, it would go into
Right, it'll
this.
drop down.
Yeah.
Exactly. So different than Abby's where we saw some discordance, we're actually seeing my gauges match. So it's like low production, low amount sticking around in the body to do its job. So just total picture of exhaustion. And that would also explain why DHEA is low. And I mean, this is again kind of back to the point I was making with yours, Abby. Like classic picture we often see with this is low sex hormones across the board. So in some ways, the fact that I was having a progesterone spike was like pretty surprising. like
It's
if it
amazing that your progesterone looked that good considering how low everything else was.
Exactly. And, just know too that this I find sometimes is what the body will purposefully do to force a person to pause or force a person to feel tired
Mhm.
to stop, from a lifestyle standpoint, like continuing to drive so hard. So,
Yeah.
we won't go into like the follow-up test I took 6 months after this. It wasn't a Dutch, it was a different type of test. But what I can say is when I saw this and I got through that race, I stopped running completely, went more so to weightlifting and walking and that type of thing. And very nicely within 6 months, like adrenals balanced
Mhm.
out, right? Like cortisol
Yeah.
production came back up. So I say that to say that this is absolutely correctable. And often it's coming from a lifestyle adjustment.
Mhm.
Single, not so much like, oh my God, you truly have physically chronic fatigue. And we have to, like, there can
Yeah.
be other physical factors, but a lot of times this is coming from just a person driving too hard, right? Like
Yeah,
in
we've
their
just been pushing it too much, and when we kind of rebalance that and take some of the stuff off the plate, then it will come back.
Exactly. So that was a big piece of it. I'm gonna kind of skip through this page because again, it's a lot of numbers data. There really isn't anything on here that's going to be different than what we'll see on the gauge page next. But just looking at kind of what's going on with the DHEA metabolites and how things are metabolizing down the androgen pathway. So, mine is a little bit more balanced. There's a very slight 5 alpha preference, which again, I find sometimes with the 5 alpha reductase activity, that's it for a lot of people inherently a little bit genetically driven. However, you know, metabolism and just insulin resistance do play a role sometimes in 5 alpha. So, if it was in the context of someone who is coming in and they're like, I'm carrying extra weight, I'm pre diabetic, or I'm diagnosed
Mm.
with type 2 diabetes, and they're really favoring this 5 alpha, I have a lot more confidence that as we regulate and balance out their metabolism, that
Mhm.
will also potentially shift the other
Bounce
direction.
it back out. Yeah, for
Yeah,
sure.
metabolic issues are not so much my problem, but I do think just kind of the way my genetics are wired, there is a little bit just like you were saying for you, Abby, like you have that 5-ADHT pathway upregulated, probably for
Yep.
you is somewhat genetically driven as well.
Yep, it
So,
is. Yeah, for sure. For sure. And
but
I think also what you were saying here about the insulin resistance and the blood sugar, think about in the case of a woman that had PCOS, right?
yes,
And we have
yes,
too much testosterone, we have insulin resistance and problems with the blood sugar, which is driving that. And here we could see how that would happen. That fan gauge would be all the way over to the right to that 5 alpha preference
totally.
because that blood sugar dysregulation would be driving the alpha metabolite. And so it's kind of like a
Totally.
self-fulfilling cycle there.
Yeah, and that's also why we often see those like male pattern baldness, high androgen symptoms in those types
Mhm.
of women that are really
Mhm.
struggling to kind of have good balancing between the androgens and testosterone. So,
Yep.
So yeah, ideally we kind of want all these gauges to match. We don't want them all low like they are in hormone. But everything is matching. DHA is pretty equally going towards both the
Mhm,
androgen and the testosterone
mhm.
pathways. Similar to Abby's test, we'll talk about progesterone in just a minute, but similar to Abby's test, my aromatization pathway is also downregulated. And just as a side note, like Abby and I were having a little bit of conversation prior to like recording this episode. We both kind of wonder if in the context of having histories of being very active, we both weightlift, we both, tend more towards that end of being athletic body types, little bit lower than average woman body fat content, still within, I would say, healthy range for sure. We both have normal menstrual cycles, that type of thing. Is it possible that sometimes that type of body may go hand in hand with a little bit less estrogen aromatization,
Mhm.
simply because we do see that pattern often again in the pre-diabetic but diabetic, metabolic syndrome state where more adipose tissue, more body fat, right? Like often that leads to over aromatization of this pathway,
Yeah,
higher estrogen levels, right?
yeah,
So
yeah.
again, not something I want to like prove or disprove, but just a curious like in
Yeah.
observation as we're kind of
Well, it
talking
just
this
makes so
through.
much sense because you think about it, like so many women that are overweight tend to have a picture of estrogen dominance, which then
Mhm.
furthers the, trouble losing weight. It causes weight loss resistance. Versus think
Exactly.
about your high level female athletes with so many of them having such low body fat, being so intensely active that they might actually lose their cycles or have irregular cycles. And it would make sense they're going to have lower levels of estrogen. So yeah, I absolutely think that's a
Exactly.
thing.
Exactly. So yeah, so let's jump up to progesterone just real quick. So I mean, again, similar to you, Abby, I have the beta pathway preference. I always tell women when I'm looking at this, it doesn't really matter so much one way or the other, but if you do have sleep issues and you're a 5 alpha preference pathway person, and we see progesterone trending low or low normal, and we were going to think about supplementing that to me gives me a little bit more certainty that if she's pushing the 5 alpha pathway, that will hopefully improve sleep quality because that's the pathway that's a little bit more associated with like,
Mhm.
supporting sleep. So in this case, though, it's not really super remarkable. Just looking at estrogen across the board, I mean, again, mine isn't too different gauge to gauge to gauge here. They're all pretty low. One thing just to note, I don't know if we mentioned this, we were going through yours, but E1 and E2 do interconvert back and forth. And so the body can kind of put it in storage form, put it in active form, and then metabolize it down these pathways to make estriol E3. The body actually indirectly makes that from estrone through the CYP3A4 pathway, the 16-OHE1 and estriol interconvert back and forth. And so we do want to make sure that we've got enough metabolism, or we could say S like 16-OH coming down this pathway to interconvert up to make
Mhm.
estriol, because as Abby was saying, that is a more breast protective, just overall protective form of estrogen that the body needs. And so again, just kind of looking at that now, similar to yours, Abby, all of my metabolites are pretty low. I am, interestingly, like favoring this 4-OHE1 pathway a little bit, above what we would optimally want to be seeing. Now, again, the metabolites are low, which is preferential in a case like this.
Mhm.
However, this is where if you do come from a history of women who have had breast cancer, whether it's your mom or your grandma, and like so many women, I do have grandmothers on both sides who have had it, right? I do think, again, there can be a genetic potential somewhat driving this in a lot of
Mhm.
people. And so, what we want to do is catch that and try to optimize it off that pathway, which we can certainly do through diet change. We can do that through utilizing certain supplements. That was really helpful to know because, again, I want to be super on top of that. I don't want to potentially like increase or miss a potential increased slight risk of cancer because my body is favoring that 4-OH pathway.
Yeah.
Um, so that was a piece that I think was really helpful just looking at the breakdown. Now that being said, obviously 2-OHE1 is in good range like yours was as well. Like yours again, Abby, the 16-OH was a little bit low. And I would just say again, the biggest concern with this for me, being a woman now in her 40s and getting older year by year, is I don't want to potentially have problems with osteoporosis, osteopenia, right? So
Mhm.
just being able to
Mhm.
kind of mind this and make sure that there's enough substrate coming down this pathway to support good bone density as we age. So
Yeah, and doing added additional things for bone health, like weight training and making
weightlifting
sure you
is
have good mineral status and things like
yes.
that.
Exactly, which is all really huge. Like to check the phase 1 clearance, which again, like yours looks really good. And then similar to yours, I also have a slight tendency towards low methylation. And like you, Abby, I've done genetic testing on myself. I know I have the MTHFR
Yeah.
genetic SNP. So that made perfect sense. I don't remember if I was taking or regularly taking like a methyl form of B12 or a methyl B complex, but sometimes clients are, and then we just realize they need potentially a little bit more support or they're just not
Mhm.
absorbing it. So the form of the B vitamin really matters too. And just realize again, we won't go down this rabbit hole. If you have these specific genetics, SNPs, or potentials that are activated, you really often do need kind of a methylated active form of B12 to fully absorb it and have it function properly in the body.
Yeah. And half the population does. It's really common.
It's really crazy. I've actually had a client as of this fall who we went through her Dutch test and same story. She looked just like this and she's like, "That blows my mind. I'm taking vitamin B12." And I'm like, "Well, go get it. Tell me what kind it
Yeah.
was." And it was
Yeah.
not a methylated form. And
Yeah.
I'm like, "It's pretty much not going, it's not getting absorbed and getting utilized properly." She's
Yeah.
like, "Oh my God, I had no idea." Right. So like
Yeah.
this is where working with a really well-trained practitioner who understands all these dynamics in the body can be so helpful because
Makes
trying to
such a
DIY it,
difference.
yeah, like go to Walgreens and pick up whatever B supplement. Like, just be very careful because a lot of times these are not high quality vitamin nutrient supplements in their active form. You take it, it's
Right.
like just going right through
Right.
you and peeing all that out, right?
Oh, yeah, totally, and so often I have the conversation with people, they'll be like, "Well, I tried taking that and it didn't work," and I'm like, "Okay, well, we need to look at how much were you taking? Was it actually a therapeutic dose? What form was it in?" Right? Because,
Yes.
was
Yes.
it a quality brand? What they say was in the bottle was actually in the bottle, right? If you just got
Yeah.
something cheap and it's in a cheap, poorly absorbable form and you're taking a tiny dose of it and not absorbing it, like, it's not gonna work, and so I think that's why a lot of times supplements get a bad rap because yes, there are those like cheap, not helpful, not therapeutic forms out there. And when people experiment with them, especially on their own, they're like, oh, this is junk. Like this didn't work. It didn't help me at all. And then, some of them have like, harmful additives and colorants and dyes and stuff in there that you shouldn't be putting in your body anyway. So that's why I'm like,
Exactly.
supplements can be wonderful, but you need to make sure that you're getting good quality supplements, that you're taking them in appropriate therapeutic doses so that they can
Exactly.
actually make the difference that they're supposed to. And if you're not, you're just kind of wasting them and wasting money.
Exactly. I agree 100%. Like, you can't skimp on this, really. It's better to just spend no money at all than to say to
Mhm.
yourself, well, I'm just going to get this $5 bottle of X and
Yeah.
it's better than nothing. I would
Yeah. No,
almost argue
no.
it could be driving more inflammation
Yeah.
depending on what it is, especially if it's a rancid fish oil. Don't
Yeah.
even get me started on the fish oil
Oh my God,
topic.
yes. Most fish oil
Like,
out there is rancid. If you
yes.
open it and smell it and it smells disgusting, like it's rotten. Like don't take
Yeah.
that. It's probably spent years on a shelf before you got to take it. So yeah, there's
Exactly. And that will drive more oxidative stress. So don't do it.
yeah,
That's
don't
just
do it. Don't do it.
little soapbox moment, but yeah. So, again, just kind of looking at this page. I mean, similar to you, my melatonin's a little high normal. For me, if this is starting to trend up, I do kind of pay a little bit of attention to specifically on the Dutch portion here, some of the brain markers, like specifically quinolinate, because sometimes we can see a bit of a pattern with upregulated melatonin in the context of things like traumatic brain injury or Lyme or mold because they are
Mhm.
so
Mhm.
neuroinflammatory.
Yeah.
And that's sometimes what can, in a sense, cause melatonin levels to go up a little bit in the body. But as long as it's within acceptable range, like that's awesome. That's kind of what we're looking for. Ours are unusual. Typically, we see the opposite with people. Most people are not
Lower.
producing sufficient
Mhm.
melatonin, but in this case, both our tests are pretty similar that way. Overall systemic cortisone to cortisol levels are pretty balanced in the body. So again, don't often see that, but in my situation at the time I took this test, it was similar to you, Abby, more in an anabolic state comparatively because DHEA production is higher relative to cortisol production there. And also similar to you, both storage form and active form cortisol are very similar as well. So like we're seeing a lot of similarities actually in both of our tests. So um, when we look at just the actual organic acid section here, so this would be a case because again, I saw that methylation pathway slightly down regulated. On paper, B vitamin status looks good, but I would still likely supplement with a complex plus some extra methyl B12. um One thing to point out with, like, the dopamine metabolites, yours, I think one was low, both of mine are low here, and this often does happen when the adrenal glands are very downregulated, right? Because
Mhm.
all of these metabolites are made in the adrenal gland. So if there's stress, if there's, HPA axis downregulation, we're often gonna see hand in hand with that some degree of, like, neurotransmitter, like, deficiency happening too,
Oh,
and
yeah, it
so
just makes sense. Your adrenals were hardly producing cortisol. Why would they be producing high amounts of dopamine or norepinephrine, which is basically
it
adrenaline?
Exactly, and that does make sense just subjectively, if whether it was me, like in this case, I know this was true, I was exhausted. You're not
Mhm.
gonna be having a lot of drive and a lot of get up and
No.
go, right? Like, that's what these hormones are associated with. I mean,
Yeah.
dopamine is more the pleasure response too, and I think just, when I work with clients that are really, really fatigued, it's like it's kinda like everything's sort of grayed out, right? Like, they're in kind of
Mhm.
a funk overall,
Yeah,
and
there's
this
no, like, there's no spark there.
there's no spark. This is the type of picture that we would expect to see if we did, hormone testing, right? And again, like, nothing really too remarkable here. I always look at 8-OHTG. I wanna make sure this is 2 or less. So, in my case, this was looking okay, all things considered. But I think, my takeaway from my Dutch was just like, "Holy shit, I'm tired. I'm doing way too
Yeah.
much physical activity for my body."
Yep.
Even though
Yep.
I could have handled this probably 15, 20 years ago, I'm
Mhm.
not at an age and stage of life where this is
Yeah.
okay, right? And
Yeah.
sometimes that's powerful too. Like as a woman, we all tend to think like this is like, well, of course I should be able to do X or Y or Z. I did that easily 10 years
Oh,
ago.
yeah, I used to do that in my 20s, I used to do that in my 30s, like, I get so many clients, women that are in, like, their 40s and 50s, and, we were kind of talking about this too, is, like, they might be overtraining, and so their cortisol often looks just like yours, they have nothing
Yeah,
left in the tank, they're completely depleted, yet they're forcing themselves to go and, like, run or do these intense hit workouts because
yeah,
they have to and they wanna lose weight, and that's what they were taught, like, "This is how you burn fat." And I see this again and again and again. Like, this is probably one of the most common things I see. They're coming in and they're like, "I'm exhausted. I'm doing everything I can. The weight is not budging. I'm super frustrated, and I'm just like pushing through because that's what I was taught to do." And I'm like, no, that doesn't work. Like, first of all, if we want to get the weight to come off, you're gonna have to fix the adrenals and the cortisol situation first. And
absolutely.
no woman ever wants to hear that, but it's not gonna happen otherwise. Like, I always tell them, like,
Yeah,
I'm really sorry. I completely understand that weight is your goal and probably the primary reason that you came in. I heard you, and that is absolutely on the table, but it's not gonna be step one. Your body is
exactly.
gonna go in the order that your body wants to go in, and until we fix cortisol, so your body doesn't feel like it's living in a state of a fight or flight or just nothing left in the tank and it's not about to survive, until that is healed and rebalanced, like you said, Courtney, which, you can do that in 3 to 6 months. We can absolutely do that, but until we do that, your body is not gonna care about losing weight. It will not shed those pounds until we do that. So if you're listening and you're like so many women out there who have been pushing and pushing and pushing, and your energy is going lower and lower and lower, and the weight's not coming off no matter what you do, I'm willing to bet you have low cortisol. You don't have gas left in the tank. Doesn't matter how much you diet or exercise, that weight's not coming off. In fact, you're probably making it worse because you're overstressing your body. There are some
Right.
things we have to heal first, and then the weight, yes, then it will come off. So that's literally like what I do every day, all the time. So I just wanted to make that point clear.
Yeah, and exactly. I think a lot of us get into this loop of, well, this worked for me in the past. Well, the body doesn't stay the same year by
Yeah.
year, right? And
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and I've had this conversation with so many people. It's like mentally we feel young, right? Like I mean, I hear from people even much older than me all the time like, I forget sometimes I'm the age I'm at. Well, of course you do, right? But
Yeah.
I think part of the process of growing older is really learning to like reevaluate the shoulds we tell ourselves. Like
Mhm.
learning how to like like titrate our limits because we it is a it's a dance. Like, it happens slowly but it also happens quickly, and I think we forget sometimes that we aren't the same as we were 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And the
Mm,
standard for what's considered adequate movement needs to change with that, or the standard for what's considered adequate rest needs to
yeah,
change with that. Right. And
yeah.
so I think a lot of these problems really do have deep lifestyle and mindset roots that often can
Mhm.
become a part of this process as we're trying to look to address everything. But
Yeah.
that's like exactly the thing, Abby. It's like these women who are like, "Well, I used to keep the weight off easily when I exercised 15 years ago." Well, that was 15 years ago. Like your
Yeah,
body's not
yeah.
the same
You
anymore,
don't have the
right?
same picture anymore, and now we need to work with your body, not against it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
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 So,
So, just for the listener, all of these things that we showcased on both of our Dutch tests, they're all fixable. They're
mhm,
all completely fixable. There's no problem that we would bring up that we wouldn't also suggest a natural solution for. So, if
mhm.
that looked kind of scary, because sometimes women will be like, oh my gosh, this is wrong, and this is wrong, and this is wrong, and everything's wrong with me, and what am I going to do? Or sometimes women will ask me, like, is this the worst you've ever seen? Am I the worst? And
That's
I'm like,
funny, right?
no, this is really common. And, the whole point of this is not to say just what's wrong with you, it's to validate how you're feeling, but also so we know what to do because we can address and rebalance each and every one of those things that showed up
Yep.
on our Dutch tests.
Yeah.
So that's why there's so much value. It's not just being able to say something is wrong, but us being able to put together a high quality protocol to rebalance you. We're going to come up with a plan. So, whether that's so it's going to be diet, it's going to be lifestyle, there's going to be nutritional things, there's going to be herbal things, there might be bioidenticals involved depending on your age and the situation and what's called for. But all of those things are on the table. And just know, like, if you're living and you're suffering with symptoms, you don't have to live that way. Like, we can fix these things.
Exactly. And along those same lines, if you are postmenopausal and you've been told it's normal to have low sex hormones and this is all normalized to you and you're still having like or transitioning to that and you're having a lot of just like menopausal like hot flashes and all of the things that come with that, like that too is something that you don't have to settle for, right? Like you can be
Exactly.
in your 60s and 70s and 80s and supporting your hormones to be in a more optimal zone, if you will. And that might look different woman to woman, but
Hmm.
that's the beauty of being able to work with the bioidenticals and some of these
Yep.
different strategies is that you can help to support longer vitality that way rather than
Hmm.
just succumbing to, the status quo rhetoric, which is like, oh, well, that's just what's supposed to happen. And like,
You
just
went through menopause, you're done now. Now you can just dry up.
get used to it. Get
Like,
used to it. This is just what you're
no.
gonna have to settle for, and you're never gonna sleep well again either there, right? Like,
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
what women are
Especially
told all.
like, don't you just love those male doctors being like, oh, well, you're just going through menopause. You're just older. Like, you're just going to have
Yeah.
to deal with the hot flashes and not sleeping and the night sweats and, the
Yeah.
vaginal dryness. Too bad for you if it hurts when you have sex. Like, I'm
Yeah.
sorry. Like, where's
Yeah.
the empathy there? And all of those things can be fixed. And so don't ever think that it's too late. If you're listening and you've already gone through menopause, like, I have older clients that have already gone through menopause. We have them on bioidenticals. It brings the life back. It also helps prevent, like, even my mom. So, I remember her being like, well, I'm in my 70s. Like, what do I need hormones for? I'm done with hormones. I'm like, Mom, you're never done with hormones because do you want to prevent osteoporosis? Do you want to prevent dementia? Do you want to prevent heart disease? Having
Exactly.
adequate levels of hormones is going to do that for you. Now, you don't have to be at the levels you were at age 25, but you need to have enough in the tank to help prevent these things. So, she had a
Yeah.
low bone scan. She had
Yeah.
low bone density. And I was like, we are testing your hormones because you probably have low estrogen. Right?
Mhm.
Or like, I see a lot too. If we have high levels of cholesterol, you probably have low estrogen. If you have blood sugar problems, you probably have low estrogen. I mean, all of these things, like our hormones are going to be playing a role. So no matter what age we are, we need to make sure we have adequate levels to stay healthy and prevent those diseases of aging. So once she understood it in that context, I was like, okay, Mom, you're not a vain person. Let's not think about it in a way of vanity. Then let's think about it in terms of disease prevention. And then it
Exactly.
clicked for her, especially when she had that low bone scan. And then she started taking it seriously, and we were able to turn that around.
Yeah, and another piece to this too, which I think is just so important if you're proactive about your health is even if you're working with a conventional provider and they're willing to put you on some sort of hormone replacement therapy, synthetic or bioidentical, in my strong opinion, you do need to be following up and getting that checked every so often, unless
Yep.
you're fully in menopause, your body's very stable, and you know that X level of estrogen progesterone support is getting you where you want. And I only say this because often I will work with clients who have been put on these things, but they're goofy things. Like they're postmenopausal and they've only been given estrogen. And I'm thinking,
Where's
hmm,
the progesterone?
where's the progesterone? That doesn't make any sense to me because both of those
Mm,
hormones in
yeah,
99.9% of women menopausally go down.
yeah,
Like,
right,
we don't
yeah,
want you wildly estrogen dominate here.
right,
And
right,
if she also has metabolic issues and overweight, I'm also going to worry she's now making too much of her own endogenous estrogen. Like,
yeah,
it just doesn't
yeah,
make sense. And so there's that. The other thing to think about too is there are different, we could do a whole podcast on this, Abby. We won't go too deep into it now, but there's different modes of delivering these hormones into the body. And again, this is just my preference. I don't work with things like pellets or like injectables, but I feel like if you're going to do something that's going to be in your system for a long period of time, all the more so you should be retesting. Because if I was, for example, recommending some sort of like topical or, edible hormone oil that's
mm,
bioidentical for a client who's
mhm,
wanting to do that to support hormones, the beauty of it is if we're overdoing it or underdoing it, we can titrate that easily, right? Like
exactly,
if it's
yeah.
sitting in your anus though, good luck getting that out. I mean,
Yeah,
literally though,
yeah,
like
it's true.
it's hard, it's much harder. It's like an IUD or something. You're gonna have to go
Mm,
back in. And
mm,
again, not to say it's impossible, but just you really want to be in the driver's seat with all of this and
yeah,
really not just say like, okay, go ahead, just put this in me or what, and
yeah.
just hope for the best. Like
That's
you
why
really
I
want to
like
be
the
tracking this.
topicals because you have
Yeah.
control over that. We have control
Yes.
over how much you use, what day you use them, so yeah,
Exactly.
those when I use bioidenticals, I'm always using the topicals or, unless it's DHEA, then that's like a capsule that you can take orally. But
Yes.
yeah, absolutely. And retesting. I'm so glad you said that because, you go
Yeah.
on a protocol, we want to make sure that it's doing what we want it to be doing, right? Because there's
Right.
what looks ideal on paper, but everyone's body is a little bit different. So we want to make sure, is it helping your levels? Are you metabolizing appropriately? And so on and so forth. So retesting within 3 to 6 months when you first get on a protocol, and then every year thereafter, if you're still on the protocol, I mean, that's ideal and that's also like responsible. So we can monitor what's happening.
For sure, for sure. Right. Hormones are powerful and we do want to get them in an optimal range for each individual client, but it's so important the client understands it enough to really drive the car, right? Like, we
Mhm,
want to partner, but I think again this kind of gets to this theme of we don't want to outsource all of that per se, in my opinion, to a
mhm,
doctor who may or may not understand that,
right.
we want these things and they are just trained differently too, Abby, right? Like, we're coming at this from a whole person balanced hormone profile perspective, wanting to use, very similar types of supports that the body would make on its own as much
Mhm.
as possible, right? Like all of those principles are kind of like the camp we're operating from. So, as the person in the driver's seat, you get to choose, but you have to be empowered with this information and knowledge to make educated choices and stay on top of all this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like, sometimes there's a lot of push and pull between like our world, the functional world, and the allopathic world, where, a lot of the doctors, like standard of care is notoriously 20 years behind. And
Mhm.
so they're still operating off of that old study, the Women's Health Initiative from 2001, that was a poorly planned study anyway, but
Yeah.
unfortunately made a lot of headlines of, oh, hormones are dangerous. And they were also using synthetic hormones. And it was a poorly planned study. And it was disproved in 2019. But of course, that didn't make headlines. And so many doctors, unfortunately, doctors have to go by standard of care or they can lose their license. So even if they've been reading the research and they know about things that are ahead of the curve, they still have to prescribe according to that 20-year-old information standard of care. Otherwise, they could lose their livelihood and their license. And so that's why doctors don't tend to be really cutting edge. It tends to be kind of the same old thing you've heard. And, not to speak
Exactly.
badly about doctors, but when it comes to hormones, we're still hearing information that's from 2001, which has been
Yeah.
disproved. And that is so old and outdated information. But a lot of women are still hearing this. This is still the rhetoric. And so that's just something to keep in mind. They mean well, but they're still going off of that older information. So if you want to get
Exactly.
more up to date with hormones, definitely look at the functional piece because we're looking at the most recent research.
Exactly, exactly. And we don't even need to touch on the whole like wormhole of like pharmaceutical complex and why there's incentive to like
Yes,
keep people on drugs
exactly.
lifelong, right? Like, that's a whole
Exactly.
nother animal in and of
Yeah.
itself. But just realize like you do have to be educated to a point. You do have to understand the motives driving
Mhm.
different forms of healthcare and then make a
Mhm.
very informed choice at the end of the day, right?
Yeah, and so much of working with us is helping you become educated so you can make those better choices. I mean, I never put women on things that they don't agree with. I teach them why they need certain things, how I would go about it, what the ideal protocol would be. And then I always say, does this resonate? Based off
Yeah,
of what you learned, does this resonate? Does this make sense? And most of the time it does, but sometimes she'll be like, no, I'm just really afraid about that. I'm like, okay, let's do something else. I'm like
exactly.
working with you because we
Exactly.
want women to be empowered to make their own choices, to trust their intuition, and to know how to make those educated decisions.
Exactly. Yeah, that's so important. Just respecting whatever the personal boundaries are. And I mean, I would say the exact same thing. Like, if we run into situations like that, and it could even be outside of hormones, to be honest with you, person could have a very complex type of autoimmune disease where they have to be managed partly by, drugs and doctors, right? Which often is the case. And so it's how can we work with that and optimize the things that she does feel comfortable or he does feel comfortable, like working with, and see hopefully some good progress. So everybody's situation is a little bit different. And I think the main thing is you want to feel like it's a partnership and you're learning and you're in control of what you want for your health. Because at the end of the day, you know your own body, you know your situation best, and you know what you're comfortable with and philosophically where you align. And I think all of that is so important, right?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Oh my gosh, this has been such a good conversation. I
Yeah.
enjoyed this so much. I hope that it was informative to you guys, to the listeners. If it was, be sure to like, comment, share it with people you know, other women you know. The more women that know about this, the more empowered we are. We can take our health back into our own hands. If you guys have questions about the Dutch test or are interested in getting a Dutch test, do not hesitate to reach out. We would be happy to help you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining me today, Courtney. And you guys stay tuned because Courtney and I, this is an ongoing collaborative thing here we got going. So stay tuned for the next one.